If you are a tech enthusiast, to say that you've been in anticipation of Intel's new architecture would be a bit of an understatement. Me personally, I've been waiting to see what Intel would do with this new lineup of CPUs for so many months now, and I was really curious, hoping that Intel would just get back up on top ahead of AMD in not just gaming but also productivity. However, in today's video, unfortunately, that is not going to be the case, especially when it comes to gaming. The new Ultra 9 285K is actually losing out to a CPU that was 3 generations old now. That's the i9 12900KS. And the reason I decided to test with the i9 12900KS is that it's one of the CPUs, or one of the last i9 CPUs, that I can actually recommend from Intel, where I personally had so many problems with the i9 13900K, and then when I got the 14900K through, that exhibited the similar behavior where things would crash, things were unstable, and just outright weird behavior on the desktop with things like either mouse skipping, or we had problems with just latency. Now, when I was testing out the 285K, I did come into some similar type issues, especially when it came to Cyberpunk 2077. That would occasionally just drop out while I was benchmarking with an RTX 4090. And then also on top of all that, there was some weird mouse skipping that was occurring when I was using the CPU. But let's look at it a little bit more in depth and show you guys some side-by-sides comparing the gaming numbers versus not just the i9 12900KS, but also the Ryzen 9 9950X, and even throw in some 7800X 3D figures, where the 285K unfortunately just doesn't come anywhere near the 7800X 3D in any of the gaming benchmarks. So if you were hoping that Intel's latest and greatest would catch up to AMD in any of the gaming benchmarks, then unfortunately you are going to come out of this review left, like I am, disappointed with the new results from Intel. However, there is some, I guess, really good news when it comes to other areas of the CPU, especially productivity. So let's look at all these numbers in depth right after today's video sponsor.
If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $15 US. After you enter that coupon code BFTYC, you can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Also works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in description below.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City. Now, for today's test system, I actually used 2 different motherboards and I cross-referenced the results just to make sure that things weren't in my head when I was seeing some of these low-performing gaming numbers. And for this, we actually used the ASRock Z890 Nova, and this managed to get a memory speed of 8600 megahertz with a setting on Gear 2. So we're getting sort of the best latency mixed in with that 8600 megahertz. And this was done at CL40, if you guys are wondering about the latency numbers there too. However, hopping across to the AMD CPUs and even the 12900KS, I decided to keep things equal on this side, going with 6200 megahertz CL28 timings, and then on AMD's side, Infinity Fabric of 2067. But the other motherboard in the equation was the Aorus Master, and this got the exact same memory speeds as the ASRock Nova, and this was actually a very stable motherboard to work with, and it was very quick and easy to get things set up. So both motherboards we used, I believe, are pretty good examples and should give you guys the best representation of this CPU, at least in its current form. And before we move into the numbers, I will talk about this CPU where it's now officially a tiled architecture. So in other words, they're producing different pieces of silicon, and in ways the same thing that Intel critiqued AMD for years and years ago. They're now essentially gluing the CPU together, and this is the result where they can mix and match different pieces. But ultimately, the goal of this is to lower production costs and increase efficiency so then they can make more money. Bit of a crude answer, but I love being cynical, especially when a company is asking nearly $600 USD for this CPU, and in Australia, 1,100 Australian dollars. So it's quite an ask, and at this price, you would definitely want a lot for your money. Unfortunately, let's move into these gaming benchmarks, and here is where you don't get a lot for your money. And moving on with the first benchmark, Age of Mythology. And the reason I test this game and I love it is because it's an underrated game. Not many people focus on it, and I want to see if the optimizations are there from Intel's side and also AMD's side. And here is where the 285K actually performed quite quite poorly in this benchmark, both on Windows 11 and Windows 10. Now, the CPU overall did perform better on Windows 11, the 24H2 official now public update. Now, another thing I will interlude with these gaming benchmarks here is that I also did try to turn all the E-cores off, just in case people were wondering if maybe just having the P-cores on only would help lift performance. Unfortunately, it did not, and in fact, it made the performance a lot worse, meaning that this time around, Intel's gone away with the hyper-threading, but they've also this way made it so that the E-cores and the P-cores are codependent on one another. So switching off the E-cores then, I believe, makes it so that the P-cores cannot no longer access that cache. And I did check this again across multiple motherboards, so it's not just the ASRock or the Aorus motherboard in this particular example. So continuing on with the slaughter, and this is probably the worst example I've seen yet. This is Cyberpunk 2077, and here's where the best result I could get was 216 out of this CPU, as opposed to say the i9-12900KS. This was a shining star for Alder Lake, where in fact, when we tuned it to 5.5 gigahertz, the 12900KS, it actually beat even the 7800X3D in this particular benchmark. And if you guys don't believe me, I'll just pull up the receipts to prove it. Though we move over now to Gears 5, and here is another poor showing from this 285K. The Ultra 9 is not looking so ultra here and performing, actually in a lot of these benchmarks, you'll also see it's performing worse than the 9950X. And now the 9950X has its own benefits outside of gaming, which kind of makes this a little bit of a sad result to see. The next title up here, Hogwarts Legacy, it again loses to the 12900KS. And then moving things over to Far Cry 6, here's where it does start to pull a little bit up in the chart numbers, scoring a decent result. And then over to Baldur's Gate 3, it does again score a pretty good result. Now, if you're looking at the i9-12900KS in Baldur's Gate 3 and looking at those 0.1% lows, that is not just your eyes, and that's not an anomaly. That is a real result, and I tested this numerous times. Baldur's Gate 3 and the Alder Lake CPU, especially in relation to the 0.1% lows, gets up in boogies, especially in this particular benchmark. So wrapping up the gaming performance numbers, at least the raw performance, what we can see with the Ultra 9 285K is it's just simply not performing that well. Now, of course, we can come back in a month's time, look at, say, Windows 11 or Windows 10, there's some sort of update released that improves the scheduler. We can revisit that, sure, but in the meantime, it's just not looking that good for the new Intel architecture. And now, one thing that they have improved on at the very least is the power efficiency. In most of the benchmarks, I did see low power draw numbers, which was surprising because that's going definitely away from the i9 formula of 12th, 13th, and 14th gen, and it's coming to sort of like a new, more efficient i9, and this does show, at least when I was looking at the wall, from most of the benchmarks. However, when I did my official Baldur's Gate 3 test, I did notice these weird spikes, and so this is going to put it behind in the charts because it did have these crazy spikes where it would just suddenly boost up out of nowhere, and that was really surprising to see. But most of the time, I guess the average power consumption is okay, but that's still cause for concern when we look at that raw figure and the max draw, especially if it's coming from a power meter on a power supply. But it is good to see that Intel have dropped the power consumption and ultimately the temperatures down of the CPU whilst we're benchmarking games. However, one thing that I will bring up, since we're talking about power consumption, is the clock speeds. Is this design by choice or is it by force? And I'm actually going to go with the latter and go with force, because when I tried to manually tune the CPU to all cores 5.5 gigahertz, ASRock told me I should be able to do this. I actually couldn't. My CPU, the sample that I had here, which was provided from another source, it just would not run at 5.5 gigahertz. Very close. However, it did crash a lot more than even with the 5.4 gigahertz. So the 5.5 gigahertz, even though you might get lucky and you might get a CPU that would do this on all cores, the one that I had here just couldn't do it. So I had to tell ASRock, look, the setting that you had in the BIOS for the 5.5 gigahertz must have been on the samples that you guys were testing with, and they must have been good samples. But now it's time to move over to productivity, but we might as well talk about power consumption and Cinebench R23. Here's where the power consumption, not just in the games, the average was okay, but also when we look at Cinebench itself, the power consumption was really good here, especially for the results it was giving out in terms of the performance. It was very slightly beating the 9950X, so I guess congratulations Intel, you managed to top the Cinebench R23 benchmark chart, and you did so, however, with a bit more power consumption on the direct CPU draw line than the 9950X. Though that being said, moving on with some other benchmarks here like Vray, here is where it does lose out to the 9950X, but then if we move over to say Geekbench 6, here's where it did score a victory. And now when we look at Geekbench 6, it does test a heap of different metrics, and so this may be something that you may wish to look into further if you want to get the best CPU for what you do. So this was actually a surprising result. So say for instance, if you're doing some sort of AI application or you're using some sort of core crunching utility, then the Ultra 9 285K may be the best in slot for you. And so that's why I'm not going to completely write it off in this review, because I feel like it does have some merit to it. And this is where it starts to come to light when we look at some of these benchmarks. And if we move over to say the Chaos benchmark, it's doing quite well here too. But then if we go over to 7-zip, it is underperforming, especially versus the 9950X. Then the final thing to talk about is the temperatures. Here's where everything was well under control on both motherboards. And we did use the Arctic 420mm water cooler for this test. And that's a really good cooler, however. So if you're using, say, standard 240mm AIOs, you may wish to look into if that cooler is going to be good enough if you want to keep this CPU, especially under 90 degrees, for example, because this CPU did manage to still get a little bit high when it came to the Cinebench R23 loop test that we ran to get the temperatures and also the power consumption results. Though with all that out of the way, it's time to put down the sheets of paper and give you guys the ultimatum with the sorry, I should say the Ultra 9 285K. And it's a weird thing that they've gone away with the i7, the i9, and the i5 and the i3. Personally, I thought they were it was a pretty good naming scheme. I just thought they could have done something a little bit different than Ultra 5, Ultra 9, because in ways it isn't Ultra at all, especially when we look at the gaming benchmarks. But in other ways, the productivity numbers is okay, but it's nothing like a revolution that the Ultra name would suggest. And also on top of that, they are using TSMC silicon this time around. So I thought we would have got bigger gains from Intel than we have seen, especially when it came to the gaming numbers. So as an enthusiast, a gaming enthusiast of PC hardware, I'm definitely disappointed in the Ultra 9, the 285K, but then there is some merit to the CPU. I'm not going to completely write it off, as I was talking about before with the productivity numbers. It is a decent CPU for some particular benchmarks, but buyer beware. I will caution you guys, I am actually not going to recommend this CPU just yet. And the reason being is during my testing, I did experience instability issues, and I did experience, again, crashing when it came to Cyberpunk 2077. And this kind of behavior makes me want to take a step back and not recommend this CPU, because there could be another potential 13th and 14th gen disaster looming in the future, and I just want to be cautious. I don't want to recommend actually anyone go out and buy the CPU just yet, even though some of the performance metrics were actually pretty impressive on the productivity side of things. So there it all is laid out for you guys with the Core Ultra 9 285K. In terms of the other variants, if you guys want me to check out the Ultra 5 or the Ultra 7, I'll see if I can get my hands on some of those samples and see if we can do some testing. But do let us know in the comments if you do want to see other types of tests in these videos for these CPUs, and I can make that happen, especially if we check out, say, the Ultra 5. But in the meantime, if you are a gamer, my recommendations at this point in time would be to, if you're on a budget, go out and look for a 7500F or a 5700 X3D. They can be had for really good prices right now, especially the 5700 X3D. You couple that in with an inexpensive B450 or B550 motherboard, get some cheap DDR4 memory, and you can just have a great experience all day, every day, without any of the instability, any of the crashing, or any of the problems that I've experienced on Intel's latter architectures. But if we also look at the 7500F, this is something that's worth pointing out, you've got an actual upgrade path. Here we've got with Intel introducing the new LGA 1851 socket. The problem is Intel does not have a good track record at all. They've now put you on 3 generations with the LGA 1700, then they've abandoned that, as opposed to AMD. If we look at AM4, that had an extremely good track record and it lasted for a very long time. And in fact, it's still ongoing because they kind of just still release CPUs for it, which is really good to see. So AMD have a great track record when it comes to longevity out of their platforms. Intel, on the other hand, do not. And so you get all these fancy motherboards that we will take a look at in a couple of weeks. I'm doing a roundup at the moment, but really that side of things from Intel is a bit disappointing to see, is the future ongoing support, especially if you go out and spend quite a bit of money to get a high-end motherboard with good onboard audio and all the features like Wi-Fi 7 and the things you want. You will be a little bit disappointed if a new CPU comes out in a few years and it's really good, but then you've got to go buy a new motherboard, right? But the last thing is, if you want the top tier gaming performance, you've got the 7800X3D, but you may have heard the rumors already, 9800X3D is apparently on the way. So you definitely want to hold out for that if you want the best gaming CPU. But again, for productivity, I'd probably still go with the 9950X, as I didn't experience any of the issues that I experienced with the 285K. So ultimately, or say, should I say, ultrally, I did see some decent numbers coming in some fields from the 285K, but overall, I'm just left with a non-recommend out of this review. And I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button and also let us know in the comment section below if you enjoyed this video and what you think of the new Ultra series. Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.